Specifically now to fathers. Again, do I have any fathers in the house? He says, fathers, do not exasperate your children, or do not provoke your children to anger. Some of your versions will say that. Then he says, instead, bring them up in the training and instruction of the Lord. Now, this is the Apostle Paul giving instructions, especially for the well-being of the family unit, the home, that this is how things ought to be. Now, and we can take a lot of time trying to dissect these scriptures, but that's not my purpose this morning. But it's just to highlight a few things, especially coming from the mind and the understanding of the Apostle Paul, where marriage is concerned and where parenting is concerned. Now, interestingly, if you move on to Colossians chapter 3, now, whereas what you find in Ephesians chapter 5 and chapter 6, now Colossians kind of gives us just a brief of the same. Just the same instructions, but in a very brief form, but yet also very informative, all the same. So in Colossians chapter 3, verse 18, this is how he puts it. Very, very just clear cut, straight to the point, no details. He just says, wives, by the way, I should have also asked, do I have any wives in the house? Wives, do what? Submit yourselves to your husbands as is fitting in the Lord. And then he turns now to husbands and says, husbands, love your wives. But notice what he says.
Don't be harsh.
In Ephesians it says, love your wives as Christ loved the church. But here he says, love your wives and do not be harsh with them. All right? And then children, he says, obey your parents in everything, for this pleases the Lord. And then, in verse 21, he says, and fathers, do not embitter your children, or they'll become discouraged. Right? So what the Apostle Paul done in Ephesians, now here in Colossians, he still gives the same instructions, only that this time he doesn't give too much detail. So if you want the detail, you go to Ephesians, but here he kind of just very pointed and punchy quotes or statements, just trying to create the well-being. This is how a household ought to be. So which means then that if we want to have healthy homes, healthy families, then we must go back to Ephesians and Colossians, and especially Ephesians chapter 5, because notice he gives us instructions. He gives instructions in chapter 5, in verse 21. Notice how he begins. He begins by saying, "Submit to one another out of reverence for Christ." So, in other words, what he's suggesting is that at the very beginning, whether you're talking about husbands and wives, or parents or fathers and children, or mothers and children, that the starting point is submission one to another. What does that mean? Submission is not subjugation or domination. That's not what he's talking about. But he's saying that there are certain things, there are certain needs, there are certain demands where a husband and a wife are concerned and they need to submit, they need to meet somewhere. Or where children are concerned. In other words, there's a certain place that even me as a father, I need to submit to my child. Are you understanding what I'm saying here? All right? Not that she's in charge now, but I need to be cognizant of the fact that there are certain needs that she has that I must be willing to submit to. That's the beginning point. Otherwise, if you don't begin there, then everything else collapses. Because as a wife, of course, I know we normally like just to say, wives, submit to your husbands, to your own husbands, which is fine, and that is good. That's his place. But remember the beginning point of all this argument, the beginning point of a husband loving his wife is submit to one another out of reverence for Christ. So in other words, the submission is not just a prerogative of wife. But then, as he now begins to flesh out what he means, so he says, wife, submit to your own husbands as to the Lord. And then he says, this is the reason. He says, for the husband is the head of the wife, as Christ is the head of the church, his body. Now, I want you to also understand something here. As the Apostle Paul is talking about marriage in his mind, and as you continue all the way to the end of that chapter, In the apostles' understanding, in Pauline theology, for him, the relationship between a husband and a wife on earth is a picture and is an earthly picture of the relationship between Christ and his bride, which is the church. Are you with me? All right? So he says, just the same way that Christ is the groom and we are his bride, he says, that grand picture, that divine picture is exemplified in the relationship between a man and a wife. Which means then that as a man and a woman get into a marital relationship, some perfection or some perfecting begins to happen. And something begins to happen with the wife and the husband as they continue submitting themselves to one another, as they continue submitting themselves to what they're supposed to be, especially according to the words of the Apostle Paul here. He says that something begins to happen between the two of you. In fact, let me show you what I mean here. So notice what he says. He says, when he's speaking out to the husbands, he says, love your wives, just as Christ loved the church and gave himself up for her. And then notice in verse 26, he says, to make her holy, cleansing her by the washing with water through the word, and to present her to himself as a radiant church. Now notice how he keeps weaving between a husband, an earthly husband, and our Father in heaven, then Jesus Christ and his bride, which is the church. Notice how he keeps weaving. So he says here that a husband loves the wife. Are you with me, husband? Let me just see. You're scaring me. You're looking at me with such. Just listen to this. So he says, love your wife just as Christ loved the church and gave himself up for her. So notice the first thing there, he's kind of spelling out the kind of love a husband is supposed to have for his wife. This is not what I normally refer to. The young people will understand this. Alejandro kind of love. This is not just romantic love. He says that's good, that's a starting point, but this is bigger than that, in the sense that he says, this is how Christ loved the church. He gave himself up for her. He surrendered his life for her. He chose to go to the cross because of his bride. But this is why he says, to make her holy, cleansing her by the washing with water through the word. So in other words, in Paul's mind, that as you love your wife, there is a certain redemptive aspect to your love where that wife is concerned. In other words, that your wife should become or get better with time if you're loving her as Christ loved the church. Now you're very quiet there. So in other words, if your wife is worse off for marrying you, the problem is you. Because it says there's something redemptive. There's something that's supposed to, a wife is supposed to blossom. So just as Christ is preparing the bride so that he can present her to himself as a radiant church without stain or wrinkle. So there's a certain redemptive aspect when a husband loves the wife as Christ loved the church. Are you with me here? So in other words, the more you love her, the better she gets, not the more bitter she becomes. I knew I was going to get an amen there, but it's all fine. It's all good. Right? So he continued there. Now remember, I don't want to delve here too much, but what I'm just trying to do is to demonstrate to us that according to the Apostle Paul and the instructions that he gives for a healthy household, that within that context of a family, as we choose to love, as we choose to submit one to another, that something is supposed to happen, something good is supposed to happen, that God is supposed to use those relationships to bring out the best in us. And that is why now he'll go and begin talking to the children. And then he finalizes that by saying, fathers, do not embitter your children. So in other words, the house or the household environment is supposed to bring the best out of us. Are you still with me up to that point? So that, now unfortunately, of course we know that doesn't always happen. Now, when turning to Luke chapter 2, looking at the experience of Jesus Christ. Now remember, Jesus Christ came in the flesh, and he was born, of course, of the Virgin Mary. But remember, Mary got married to Joseph. And eventually Mary and Joseph had other children. Right? So as Jesus Christ is growing up, although he was the firstborn in that family, but he also had step siblings in that home. Joseph was not his father. In other words, now think with me here. Jesus grew up in a blended family. Right? It was not a perfect situation. But he was still the Christ. Now, in Luke chapter 2 and verse 52, the Bible says this. And Jesus, just giving a summary statement of his experience, he grew in wisdom and stature and in favor with God and with man. Now, in the Message translation, those two verses, 51 and 52, combined together, this is what the message is. So he went back to Nazareth with them and lived obediently with them. His mother held these things dearly, deep within herself. And Jesus matured, growing up in both body and spirit, blessed by both God and the people. Now, just in that verse alone, you can see a few things. First and foremost, he grew up physically, which means that he grew up to be healthy. He also grew up mentally, he grew up in wisdom, cognitively, he grew up and he was doing well. But also spiritually, because the Bible says that he grew up in favor with God. It means that also spiritually he was being nurtured, but he also grew up to have favor with man. In other words, he was able to socialize, he was able to live within a certain community. So when I looked at this particular statement in Luke chapter 2 and verse 52, it kind of gives me an idea that when you grow up in a home environment, that something is supposed to happen to you. Apart from growing up physically, maybe as a child, but also you're supposed to grow up cognitively. You're supposed to grow up mentally. You're supposed to mature up. But also you're supposed to grow spiritually. And also you're supposed to grow up being able to exist within a certain community. You should already have some social skills around you. But again, unfortunately that doesn't always happen. So a healthy family environment, then, we can say, looks like this, that it is a place or a home, an environment where love prevails. But then secondly, a healthy home environment is where your personality is actually shaped. It is a place where your character is formed. It is a place where your social skills are developed. It is a place where physical development is nurtured. It is a place where gifts and talents are supposed to blossom. But it's also a place where you are spiritually formed. Now, I know that's a mouthful, but we need to move on. And so let's look at what then does emotional abuse look like? Because like I've already said, that there's a lot of abuse that happens sometimes in our lives. And I know that none of us comes from a perfect home or a perfect situation, but there's a lot of abuse that actually happens. Now, when we talk about physical abuse, that one is a little bit much more overt because it's open and people talk about it a bit more readily. But the one that normally we don't talk about is emotional abuse. Now, emotional abuse by parents, let's begin with parents. Emotional abuse by parents involves verbal or behavioral actions that jeopardizes a child's sense of worth and safety, both emotionally and even physically. So anything then that jeopardizes the picture that we have already seen in Luke chapter 3 and verse 52, talking about the life of Jesus Christ, or anything that jeopardizes what the Apostle Paul was talking about in Ephesians and in Colossians, then we can assume that to be emotional abuse. Anything that will not produce those results that we've just already highlighted. Emotional abusive parents put a child at immediate risk and can lead to negative mental, emotional, and physical consequences that even sometimes often will persist for many. You can be 50 years old, 60 years old, but something that happens to you when you are still a child, a teenager, or maybe when you're growing up still affects you. Emotional childhood abuse is categorized as an adverse childhood experience, what they call SCE. And those of you maybe not field of psychology know this better than me. But adverse childhood experiences are potentially traumatizing events in childhood, and research has actually linked them to chronic health problems. So they'll affect you even physically, mental illness, and substance abuse issues in adolescence and even into adulthood. Childhood emotional abuse by a parent can also strain a person's ability to maintain a healthy relationships later in life. It can make a child feel flawed, unloved, unwanted, endangered, or valued only to meet someone else's need. Now, when a parent is chronically emotionally invalidating, for example, by shaming, right, or overly criticizing your child, or even insulting, or even mocking your children, the child sometimes will feel constantly judged and inadequate, and ends up developing a whole host of negative beliefs about themselves. These are things that have actually been researched, and it is actually true. And I know that many of us, especially those who are probably who are a bit older, did not grow up in exactly perfect situations. Times have changed, and I think now we know better. Maybe we're raising our children a little bit better. We were just talking about it earlier in the morning with my wife. You know, that some of the things that maybe some of us went through, maybe as we were growing up, especially in those past years, today will actually be categorized as abuse, isn't it? Mm-hmm. Today will be categorized. But the sin will be if we go on and pass them on to the next generation, to our children. There are things that maybe your parents told you, you can't tell your child, especially Gen Zs. Mm-hmm. Are you with me? Mm-hmm. There are ways that maybe you grew up, you cannot subject your children to the same thing, but unfortunately, sometimes our children end up being raised in the same way, or we end up saying the same things, or doing the same things, or ignoring our children, sometimes shaming them, withholding affirmation, not telling them that we love them. You know, you will not touch them, you will not come close to them, and sometimes you don't realize that those things sometimes can be considered as forms of emotional abuse. Now, when we shame children, their shame can easily turn into borderline personality disorders, BPD, or BPD, substance abuse, or sometimes they can even become. So I was just waiting for you for my flight. So there was this particular lady. She looked like a younger lady, but she had a son. This little guy. The guy was probably maybe between 6 or probably about 7 or 8 years of age. I don't know. But now, how many of you know that a 6-year-old or a 7-year-old or an 8-year-old boy, they're hyperactive most of the time? It's very difficult to get them to sit in one place for long. I mean, they tend to be aggressive. They're all over the place. They're restless. So this boy, obviously, just a typical little guy. He was there, and he was everywhere. He was under the table. I mean, boys. I mean, he was just everywhere, just having a good time. And his mother was getting so frustrated with him. And I think what caught my attention is that the lady was getting, and this is the mother, she was getting so frustrated, and she would be screaming at the top of her voice and calling him names. And I felt sorry for that boy. Because some of those words, sometimes we forget. Long after you as a parent have forgotten you told him that it's a kichwangumu, it keeps ringing in that child's mind. Are you with me? And then you wonder why, when he becomes a teenager, he's a real kichwangumu. Because you implanted that idea in him, and he began to believe it. Are you with me? And these are things that sometimes we normalize, name calling. You know what I'm talking about? Things start forming. Alright? Because she's turning into a woman. You have to be very careful about making certain jokes. Are you with me? Things I can't even say on this pulpit. Really, I can't. Honestly, I can't. But you have to be very careful. Alright? Or even your teenager, your little boy. And then now he's maturing, and then maybe now he's beginning to form little beards and what have you. But then maybe his voice has taken long to break. You don't joke about those kind of things, by the way. Because when you begin joking and no, you start talking like a girl. It's humiliating for him, and it can be a joke to you. You can laugh about it, but it leaves an impression like a child. Or belittling their accomplishments. Your child comes home, they're excited. They're so excited that maybe they got a C in something, and maybe because they've been an A, maybe they have been struggling. But instead of acknowledging their effort, you say, "Hi, a C. I thought you could have gotten a B or an A." Or putting down their interests, or insulting or trying to control them. Maybe their clothing or their hairstyle, or what we call infantilizing. You are acting as though you know what's best for them. Treating them like a child, and the guy is now a teenager. They don't like that. And we can go on and on in those lists, and these are things that sometimes we don't really think through. Sometimes we don't really take time to ask ourselves, is this going to affect my child negatively? And we have to be, especially those of us of the household of faith, and this is where this is coming from, friends. Listen, we have to be extremely careful as we raise it. Maybe for you, you are past that stage of raising children, but now you have grandchildren. All right? When they are brought to you, are your grandchildren safe in your arms? What will you tell? What are you telling them? Are you encouraging them? What words are proceeding from your mouth? And signs, let's just look at a few signs of an emotionally abused child. Just a few signs. Unhealthy coping strategies or habits. And you'll notice sometimes a child begins sucking their thumb, or they begin biting their nails, or rocking, or sometimes even self-harm. And especially, by the way, these things are becoming more and more common in our times, where kids are becoming, where they engage in self-harm, cutting themselves and all kinds of things. Or mental health disorders, anxiety, depression, or even they develop phobias, or inability to trust, or difficulty forming relationships. You find that they become antisocial, they are more withdrawn, or destructive, aggressive, or antisocial behaviors. Some kids, especially when they have not been affirmed, and maybe they have been abused, or maybe the father was not there, especially where fathers are concerned, sometimes it predisposes our young people, especially young boys, to a lifestyle of crime. Did you know that, by the way? These are things that have actually been proven. Or even drugs and alcohol abuse. And sometimes you wonder how come they entered into some of those vices. It's because they're trying to fill up a void on the inside. Nobody told them they were beautiful. Nobody told them or believed in them. Nobody told this young man that he can make it. So they find comfort, sometimes in the wrong places, or sometimes developmental delays. A guy is 25, but he's still behaving like he's 15. Has refused to grow. Sometimes we send them to school, they even have a degree. It predisposes them to become more vulnerable to high-risk sexual behavior. Did you know that? And these are things that have been proven, by the way. For instance, they say that when you do not affirm, for example, let's just talk about our girl church, our daughters. When we don't affirm, especially as a father, if you don't affirm your daughter, if she doesn't hear you telling her that she's beautiful, that you love her, every now and then you embrace her and she feels safe in your hands. What happens if you don't do that long enough? It creates a void in her. And then the first fool, are you hearing me? Who comes and shows her some bit of affection, she ends up into their arms. And sometimes we wonder, what are you looking for? And sometimes our young people become promiscuous. By the way, even for young men, it is said, and it is true, it is a fact, that as a father you must affirm that young man as he's growing up. Let him know, let him find his identity in you. And especially in these days of same-sex relationships and what have you, if you don't do that, you also predispose them. Sometimes they can be taken advantage of. Or sometimes this ends up behavioral problems or disorders, difficulty, sometimes regulating their own emotions. They don't develop an emotion like you, or physical disorders or health issues, suicidal thoughts, or some of them even attempt suicide, or overly adaptive behavior. Have you ever met somebody who is overly adaptive? And I hope some of you are not like that, where you're very compliant or very defensive. You either go along with everybody else, or nobody can tell you anything. You're always very defensive, you're always fighting. Have you ever met people who are always ready for a fight? Anybody like that here?